which is a cross-professional dialogue between academics, journalists, as part of an ongoing series sponsored, funded by Carnegie Foundation. So we would like to thank Carnegie for that. This series investigates and conveys information about Russia's foreign policy with various regions of the world. We've had panels last year on Russia, Turkey, and Russia, Africa, and now we have a panel on Russia, Latin America. We conceptualized this panel actually before the war began, because Russia has sought to increase its relations with individual Latin American states and has also sought to challenge U.S. influence in Latin America. It has, of course, kind of solidified its ties with traditional allies like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, but it has also been in the process of expanding relations with states such as Brazil and Argentina in recent years. And now, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many states in Latin America have responded in ambivalent ways. It's a very complex and dynamic situation. So we have brought together an excellent panel of experts to discuss various aspects of Russian Latin American relations. So now a few words about format for today's session. We will have each speaker talk for about 20 minutes. And then we will turn to a question and answer period. So I encourage you, when questions our viewers to occur to you, to please write your questions in the question and answer box, and we will turn to them after the presentations by each of the speakers. And with that, I will turn to our first speaker, Dr. Vladimir Rouvinski. He is a professor in the Department of Political Studies and the director of the Laboratory for Politics and International Relations at Elise University in Cali, Colombia. He also coordinates the university's Pacific Alliance Studies program. Vladimir's main area of expertise is Asian and Russian relations with Latin America and with the Caribbean. And for over 10 years, he was chair of the Asia and America section at the Latin American Studies Association. Before joining Elise in 2007, Vladimir worked with educational and research institutions in Russia, Japan, and Colombia. He's also held research positions at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and the Georg Eckert Institute in Braunschweig, Germany, and Florida International University in Miami, Florida. Among his most recent books are Rethinking Post-Cold War Russian Latin American Relations with Routledge, published recently in 2022, and Between East and West, State, Nation, and Conflict in Contemporary Ukraine, published in Spanish in 2022. So welcome, Vladimir, and we are very eager to hear your insights on the subject.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you so much for this invitation to talk on the topic which I consider to be very important. As you mentioned, in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine, that became very pertinent to what is happening here in Latin America, not only since February last year, but I think it was growing. Its impact was growing along with the growing interest of Russia to Latin America. So I will show some slides to make some of my points more present on the screen. And what I would like to talk actually in this introductory talk, perhaps, is to emphasize changes, but also continuities of Russian engagement in Latin America following Russia's war in Ukraine. And in order to do so, I would like to focus on four pillars of what I consider to be the most important dimensions of Russia's engagement of Latin America. First of all, and I think it's really necessary to talk about the idea of Russia's being back to Latin America, and to show what is similar to what the Soviet Union was doing in the Western Hemisphere during the times of the Cold War, and what is different in terms of what Russia is doing in Latin America and the Caribbean after these perhaps 2 decades, especially when Vladimir Putin took power in Moscow in early 21st century. I would also like to emphasize why does Latin America matter Russia, because in many cases it is something that sometimes is overlooked by many experts who, from my perspective, tend to apply a kind of traditional understanding of Russia's interest towards Latin America. But I think it's quite different. It's quite interesting what Russia is doing in Latin America. I would also to talk about the ways of engagement, what kind of tools Russia is using to engage Latin America in terms of its agenda in the region, but also global. And last but not least, of course, the topic that convened us today to talk about the impact of the war in Ukraine in terms of Russians' interest in Latin America, but also, and I think it's also important to emphasize this, what kind of reaction is on Latin American side. How Latin American leadership, how Latin American elites, but also how Latin American public opinion view what is happening in Ukraine and understands what kind of impact it has on their well-being of their present and future. So let me start discussing a little bit the idea of Russia's return to Latin America. And when we talk about Russia being back, and many of us talk, and many political leaders talk about Russia being back to Latin America, is something like the Soviet Union is back. And I've noticed that each time more, Russia itself, Moscow, wants to create this kind of perception that today's Russia is more or less Soviet Union 2.0. And this is kind of a message that resonates quite well with many political elites here. And this is actually one of the reasons, and we can discuss this later, why most of the people and political leaders who support, in a way, or at least we perceive their position as a support of Russia, belongs to the left spectrum, to the left of the political spectrum in Latin America. And one of the reasons, because they explicitly or implicitly make equal today's Russia to what the Soviet Union was. And I think it is a mistake, because today's Russia is not the Soviet Union. And as I will show in a moment, the basic interests of Russia in Latin America are quite different from that of the Soviet Union. So my message here is we have to make sure that we differentiate what is similar, because there are indeed some similarities, especially in the ways of strategic communication in Latin America, but there are also many more differences. To begin with, Russia is not prepared to invest the same amount of tangible resources as the Soviet Union did in Latin America. Russia, for example, is not interested by any means to go back and support Cuba the same way as the Soviet Union did, right? And also, I think it's important to understand that Latin Americans also are well aware about this unwillingness of Russia to make things in the way the Soviet Union did. The other point to mention here is the fact that it is inevitable to mention and to notice that Russia's interest to Latin America has been rising in parallel with the rise of Vladimir Putin to power in Moscow. And especially we can see the change of Russia's attitude towards Latin America following the 2007 speech of Putin in Munich, when he denounced for the first time publicly the West and tried to present Russia as the power that wants to become an alternative pole of international power, global power. And then, of course, the 5 days war with Georgia, because it was Nicaragua which came forward and supported Putin at the moment when Russia was suffering, because nobody wanted to support Russia actually publicly. So it indicated that there is some potential, important potential for Russia in Latin America. Once again, I will talk a little bit more about this when I will be talking about this, what I believe are 5 elements of behind Russian interest to Latin America. But again, it is important to take into consideration the fact that Russian strategy became more and more firm, more and more solid towards Latin America, in parallel with Vladimir Putin's changing attitude on the global arena. Having said that, I think the first 2 decades of Russia's being back to Latin America was a marriage of convenience. And why I'm using this kind of parallel is because we still do not have any shared ideology between Latin American leaders and Russia's leaders. Of course, we can find some similarity in the way they look at the US and the West in general term, what Russia's calling collective West, the dominance on the international arena. But I think it's far from what used to be ideological coincidence between the Soviet Union ideology, the communist ideology, if you wish, and how Latin American political leadership was viewing the Soviet Union back in the Soviet times. It does not exist still. We can talk also about this if there are any kind of indication that there is some closeness in this kind of illiberal ideology promoted by Vladimir Putin and the Russian contemporary elite on the international scene. But so far, I think there is a kind of rational, almost rational choice idea of Latin American leaders to approach Russia because they understand perfectly the nature of what Russia is doing and why Russia doing is what is doing. And of course, they want to have some tangible benefits for this. But 2022, and I will talk about this in the last part of my today's intervention, my presentation, that basically I believe, in fact, indeed, 2022 is a kind of a crossroad, not only for Russia in Latin America, but also for Latin America as well. And not everything that might seem as connected to Russia's war on Ukraine is an explanation of why Latin America is changing in attitude toward the United States, toward the Western nations, but also looking for a new place, new role in this rapidly changing international arrangements. Now, I will talk about 5 keys from my perspective that can explain why does Latin America matters to Russia. And the first key from my perspective is what I call a symbolic reciprocity. And I was in a way satisfied, fortunately or unfortunately, but reading the 2023 Russian foreign policy doctrine, because some people were saying, let's say, a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, some, especially of Russian commentators, were saying that perhaps the idea of near abroad sort of disappeared from the repertoire of the Russian narratives of the Russian political leaders, but near abroad is still there. So I think in this audience, it is not necessary to explain what near abroad means for Russia in terms of its foreign policy. But from my perspective, and each time I find more evidences, it's the fact that Russian elites view the entire Latin America and the Caribbean as the United States near abroad. So the point of departure for them is that Latin America still matters a lot for for the United States, for Washington, and we may discuss this. It may not be true in a sense that it by no means it's still hold this same kind of importance as it used to be during the Cold War. But the fact is here, and what is important is that Russian elites do believe that the U.S. near abroad still matters, and that is why most of the action they do in Latin America fall into this idea of reciprocity. But this reciprocity is symbolic. It started, I think, this kind of strategy started very clearly after the 5-day war in Georgia that I mentioned. When in response to the U.S. support to Georgia, Russia sent some military planes here, Russian Navy ships made some visit to some ports. And of course, even though Moscow insisted that there is no connection, there is a connection. And they repeated this on some other occasions. So this kind of idea that we can reciprocate what the US is doing in Ukraine is very much present here because it's symbolic. It resonates well with the Russian domestic audience, the idea that Russia is a great power again, that is global reach, that it can do some damage to the United States, the enemy, just there, in Cuba, Nicaragua, and some other places. But it remains symbolic, at least for now, because Russia is not interested in investing the resources, and simply, I believe that there is not enough money for Russia to build something bigger. Having said that, there is a potential, especially I see this in Nicaragua and maybe to a certain extent in Venezuela, that Russia may do in the future something bigger than simply symbolic and rhetoric visits. They have this potential, but it's also depends on the bad or good luck for Moscow in terms of the war in Ukraine. So there is a connection again. The other point is Russia is an energy superpower, and we do know there is not too much investment, and that's in Latin America, perhaps except of what Igor Sechin and Rosneft was doing in Venezuela. But this idea still remains very much alive, especially when we hear some of the experts' talks of, for example, the Institute for Latin America of Russian Academy of Science, when we see some other. Russia is considered there is potential for them to invest, also talking about nuclear energy, talking about possibilities to do something in the future. So this is a potential which has a little tangible presence as far as we can say in 2023, but we should not disregard this as one of the possibilities, especially thinking about the rapidly changing markets for Russia because of the Western sanctions, because of the situation that is quite uncertain, and because of the also global changes. The other third key, for me, it's also important, it's a personal diplomacy, because if you look at the way how Russia engaged Latin America, and in many aspects, it's basically person to person. And we do know that Putin values a lot the level of personal trust he builds with personal leaders, and that's always saying, in democracy, you change leaders every 4 years, and I have to, find a way to build the trust. Here, the people are all the same, Maduro or Ortega, it's easy to deal with them in Cuba, and even in Brazil. I think Carrie will talk a little bit more about Lula being back on the stage. But yes, Putin really values this kind of personal trust, and he has plenty of these possibilities in Latin America. And when we talk about Putin's new Russian constitution of 2020, at least Putin will remain in Moscow for a long time. I think, well, disregarding some of the news today and the attempt to bomb Kremlin with some drones, but again, I mean, Putin is there. Business opportunities, and this is an interesting topic because it is by no means business as usual there. If we look at the amount of trade, of course, Russia is very weak, even though there has been tremendous growth. But from comparative terms, I think maybe 2008, 2009, I'm not sure with the exact number now, but when Russia's trade with Latin America surpassed that of the Soviet Union. But despite of this, and despite of the fact that, yes, trade is growing, we still have kind of difficulties, I think, for Russia to engage more heavily Latin American partners. Russian arms, exactly, are there. In the case of Venezuela, in the case of Mexico, Peru, and especially when we talk about Nicaragua, in the case of Nicaragua, almost all weapons Nicaragua has are Russian-made. And when all these things happens in terms of the U.S. failed attempt to make sure that Latin American countries may supply weapons to Ukraine, one of the reasons, of course, was Despite of the attempts, I believe there was also an attempt to show solidarity with the United States and the West in terms of sides during the conflict in Ukraine, but also the fact that it's easy for Ukrainians to use those weapons because those weapons were manufactured in the Soviet Union still in many cases, but also by Russia. So Ukrainian militaries are quite familiar with these weapons. Why it's failed, these attempts also we can discuss later on. But if we compare, for example, with the United States, of course, the US remains in many cases by far, this 100% more trade with Mexico, 10 more with Brazil, by far the most important trade partner for Latin American nations. And also we have to talk about China, the other table that you can see on the screen. Russia and China just positioned too differently. China is just too important for Latin Americans in terms of trade. And despite of all this bravura rhetorics by part of Moscow, of course, Russia failed to move any significantly, to replace some of the other rivalries in terms of the trade. But having said this, of course, this is not business as usual. In some of the cases, Russia does have some significant advantage. For example, when we talk about fertilizers, Russia managed to construct the dependence. I mean, the Brazilian case is very explicit in this. Brazilian agricultural sector, to an important extent, depends on the supply of Russian fertilizers. And in some other places, we also see there is a possibility of some of the groups, of some business companies who are very well connected to local governments, as well as to Russian government, to make maybe not a significant money in terms of the overall trade, but yes, make some profits for some particular groups of people, especially supplying some humanitarian aid or supplying some other stuff. Again, this also connected to the other key of Russia interest that I was mentioning. This is personal diplomacy. The people with some appropriate links can gain significant advantage in doing this stuff. And last but certainly not least, strategic communication. This is, of course, has been a success story for Russian strategic communication. I believe RT was using, at least initially, I think they didn't expect to have such a success story in Latin America, but RT did a lot of stuff in terms of strategic communication. Today is definitely one of the alternatives, sources of information for many Latin Americans. Again, we can talk later on why they have been so successful, but I think initially they actually found this kind of gap between the offer that was available to Latin Americans, especially young people, with the traditional media in Latin America itself and traditional media from the United States. So there was a demand for some kind of alternative sources of information. So RT, because they had all the budget, they had guaranteed budget, so they didn't have any troubles. They didn't have to evaluate the losses and profits of entering to Latin American markets. They were able to do this. I think the exception there is precisely Brazil, because there is no RT broadcasting in Portuguese. There is a Sputnik, I think, in Portuguese, but with the exception of Brazil, I think we have a lot of evidences to talk about the penetration by RT media to Latin American informational market. And I would like to make now the connection to the last part of this introductory talk. This perhaps some of you knows this kind of quote by Margarita Simeonenko, editor-in-chief of RT Networks. Actually, I think almost 10 years ago, she was saying why it is so important to have for Russia to have its own TV channel in English and other languages. And that she was saying it is important that there is a TV channel that people start to rely upon as their source of information. Later on, when necessary, you can use this channel to show them what you need and when you need. In a sense, not having your own foreign broadcasting is like not having a Ministry of Defense. When there is no war, it seems like it is not needed. But damn, when there is a war, The failure of having a Ministry of Defense is critical, but you can't create a reliable army a week before the war begins. Why this is important? Because we published with a colleague of mine recently a paper which we called Russia's Many Wars and Their Effect on Latin America. Because what we found just looking at the narratives by Russia is that Russian elites, Russia believe that it in the constant war in almost all areas of engagement internationally, when it comes to energy, when it comes to information, when it comes to politics. And this idea of being in war actually dictates certain logics in how Russia approached Latin America. And there, when we have find, at least from my perspective, some continuities and some changes in terms of Russian engagement with Latin America as the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And what I would like to emphasize, and you can see now on the screen the results of some votings that was taking place in the United Nations, and you see a great degree of ambiguity on the part of Latin American nations when they have to support or reject the Russian position and Russian explanation why Moscow did and why Moscow continued doing what they're doing in Ukraine. One of the factors to take into consideration, I think Moscow is well aware of this, and the other slide that you see here, this is the results of research done by some colleagues in the UK. And basically, they've shown that Latin America perhaps is the only region in the entire world where there is still a positive attitude towards the West, comparing to Russia and China. But the things are changing. So the fact that these things are changing, and what I would like to emphasize, is not necessarily a direct outcome of Russia's effort to engage the region in terms of what is happening in Ukraine. And why I think that it is so. Of course, Russia, yes, I'm finishing already, because Russia's war in Ukraine, of course, was a kind of an impetus, a kind of a starting point to make things different for Latin America. But the idea for Latin America is to be in a sort of standby mode. They want to see how the rules of the games are changing and what will be the outcome. For what they see now is the failure of the United States and the West to stop the war. And for them, it is a message that the world is changing. And in this context, Russia, I believe, will continue to use the tools of symbolic reciprocity mostly and the strategic communication to achieve their goals, in terms of strategic reciprocity. But we shall see what will happen in the next. And I will be happy to answer the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for that excellent overview and raising of many points. Now we will turn to Dr. Elena Pavlova, who is a researcher at Johannes Goethe Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Her research interests include post-colonial theory and critique, Latin American studies, ideology and discourses in Russia. Her publications on Latin America include A Russian Challenge to Multipolarity, The Prospects for Political Cooperation Between Russia and Latin America, published in 2018 in Problems of Post-Communism. Also, Indigeneity and Subaltern Subjectivity in Decolonial Discourses, a Comparative Study of Bolivia and Russia, published in the Journal of International Relations and Development, also in 2018. And The Regional and the Universal, The New Democratic Discourses in the Russian Federation and Latin America, in a book edited by Morozov, Decentering the West, The Idea of Democracy and the Struggle for Hegemony. So with that, I will turn to Dr. Pavlova.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to express my opinion about Latin America-Russia relationship. Well, I am afraid that I will not say future of Latin American-Russian relationship, because I have a lot of doubts about this future. And in my brief speech, I will continue some points proposed by my colleague, by Professor Vladimir Rouvinski. And I would like to begin also with the idea of the Soviet past, of the reflection of the Soviet past in the contemporary Russian foreign policy. And this is why I would like, firstly, I would like to speak about the new concept of the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, which was published 1 month ago. I think it is a very important document because this document explains very clear a new position of Russian Federation towards not only Latin America, but also towards non-Western countries. Because in this document we can find a very important point. Russian Federation make efforts to change its image of aggressor and tries to represent the war against Ukraine as a part of big fight of Russia against the neo-colonial West. Russia fights not only for itself, according to this concept, but also for Asia, Africa, and Latin America also. And this concept of the foreign policy, Russia speaks about new goals. Well, I would like to quote this document. This goal is to eliminate the vestiges of domination by the United States and other unfriendly states in global affairs, create conditions to enable any state to renounce neo-colonial or hegemonic ambitions. And here I see a tentative of Russian elite to present the war against Ukraine as a continuity of Soviet policy, as tentative to present this war as a war against Western values and unipolar system. Also, when we speak about continuity of Soviet policy, we can remember another part of this concept where we can find a very clear paragraph. And in this paragraph, we can find information about extensive existence of Soviet Union in the colonization and the formation of statehood of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I would like to emphasize that I don't think that Russia has special strategy towards Latin America. I think that today Russia does not have enough sources in order to formulate some concrete proposals to Latin American states. And this is why Russia tries to use past partnership and try to use Soviet legacy in order to change image. And then I don't think that Latin American states, Latin America as a region is so important for Russian Federation. Well, in this concept, we can find only four states: Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Russia would like to emphasize that only with these states Russia is ready to reinforce friendship and partnership. Speaking about other countries, Russia is ready to develop relationship, taking into account the degree of independence and constructiveness of their policy towards the Russian Federation. This is also a quotation from the concept of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. Well, now I would like to say some words about these countries, how I see this partnership. Well, speaking about Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we know that these countries demonstrated full support of the Kremlin's agenda against Ukraine beginning 2014. And the question why these countries supported Russian aggression without some doubts. And here, answering to this question, I also would like to touch the question of Russian soft power like Russia today. Well, I think I completely agree with the idea that that representation of United States as enemy is an important point, is an important element of Russian soft power in Latin America. But also, I have impression after my personal field research in Latin America that one of the sources of Russian soft power in Latin America, this is a lack of knowledge about contemporary Russia. And at the same time, mass media is full of different Soviet legacy myths. So what I would like to say that, of course, I don't like to say that political experts or political elites have not information about the situation in Russia. I speak rather about ordinary people, about grassroots people who have impression that Russia, that anti-imperialism as a key Soviet Union doctrine is still remain as a principal point of Russian foreign policy. This is why this is not very complicated to promote new Russian agenda also. Russia today is speaking about decolonization. Decolonization is an important political trend of domestic and foreign affairs of Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And this is why I don't see a big problem for political elites of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to proclaim this support to Russian agenda. And I think Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela will support Russia in the future. But I don't think that this situation will play a very important role because the situation with this war, the situation with Russian Federation is so hard that this is not so important, I think. But speaking about Brazil, I see this situation more sophisticated, because I think that before 2014, before the annexation of Crimea, I think the relation between Russia and Brazil were very good, and the principal points of this partnership was idea about multipolarity and BRICS. Brazil and Russia had a lot of different contexts and projects about communication, partnership, exchange in the framework of BRICS, in the framework of idea to construct a new world. But the situation with Crimea changed a lot this situation, because Brazilian political elite understood that Russian interpretation of multipolarity is absolutely different than that Brazilian interpretation of multipolarity. Because if Brazil if Brazil would like to construct more equal, more just world, of course, with Brazilian leadership, but I speak about whole system. Russian interpretation of multipolarity, this is idea of the world divided into spheres of influence with regional hegemon, and this scenario, I think it is this scenario can be described as the worst scenario for developing countries, because in this situation, a regional hegemon would demand an exclusive right to dictate the rules to smaller states. And of course, in this situation, the regional hegemon in Latin America will be United States, not Brazil. But at the same time, the position of Brazil after this annexation was very careful, because Brazil declared that the Russian Federation and Ukraine must have a constructive talks aiming at the resolution of their differences. Well, I think this position can be explained by two facts. Firstly, Brazil did not like to split completely the relation with Russia. But and the second argument, I think this is Brazilian ambition in peacekeeping area. I would like to remember that in 2011, Brazil promoted this initiative, responsibility while protecting, and so Brazil preferred to be more moderate, blaming Russia. But speaking about a contemporary situation, well, when I said about the lack of language, I don't think that Brazil has the same problem, because of course Brazilian ordinary people have more information about the Maidan and Russian-Ukrainian relations, and also about, for example, Bucha and other criminal situation of this war. Also, Brazil has more complex political spectrum than that in ALBA group, and neoliberal values are more disseminated, and the narrative of decolonization is also popular, but this is not so important like in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And this is why we have this strange situation with Lula declaration in Portugal and Spain 2 weeks ago, when Lula da Silva declared that from the one side, no one can doubt that Brazilian condemned Russia's territorial violation of Ukraine, but at the same time, Lula da Silva said, there is not use now is saying who is right, who is wrong. What we have to do now is stop the war. Also, Lula da Silva said that it is mistake happened and the war started. So Lula da Silva has a very ambivalent position, and I think that for Brazil it is complicated it is very difficult to manage the same neutrality as were proclaimed by Argentina and Colombia, because the expectation from Brazil are more higher. It is not possible to be a great power without clear position. And this is why I think the relation between Russia and Brazil will get worse. Well, what can Russia expect? I will finish with this. I think Latin America don't stop at accusing the West, but also blaming, will blaming the Russian Federation for causing a rupture, in the fragile multiple stability. And I don't think that trade under sanctions was very successful. I think these expectations were not realized. And so I think the best option for Russia is neutrality of Latin American states. If Russia manage this neutrality, I think it will be the best option. Also, I would like to say about new wave of Russian immigration to Latin America, because I feel finished, because today we can see a very big wave of Russians to Latin America, and perhaps this new Russian community will change the relations between Russia and Latin American state, but this is a long-term forecast. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elena. That's an interesting final point, and a lot to think about there. Okay, and now we will turn to Carrie Kahn. Carrie is NPR's international correspondent based in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and her reports can be heard on NPR's award-winning news programs, including All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition. Some of the recordings are on npr.org. Previously, she spent a decade based in Mexico City in Mexico, covering Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America. She arrived in Mexico in the summer of 2012 on the eve of the election of President Enrique Peña Nieto and the PRI's party's return to power, and reported on everything from the rise in violence throughout the country to its powerful drug cartels and the arrest, escape, and rearrest of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. She also reported on the Trump administration's immigration policies and their effects on Mexico and Central America, the increasing international migration through the hemisphere, gang violence in Central America, and the historic détente between the Obama administration and Cuba. Kahn is the recipient of the 2020 Cabot Prize from Columbia Journalism School, which honors distinguished reporting on Latin America and the Caribbean. Carrie?
Sorry, I was muted. As you could tell in that list of my biography, nowhere does it say anything about an expert on Russia and Latin American relations. So that is not my expertise. So please bear with me. I do appreciate both of your comments before, and I don't want to repeat the great things that you already said. I was shaking my head and agreeing with many of them, especially with regard to the Global South. And also, I've found Vladimir's discussion of Nicaragua fascinating. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that in the chat, because I was just going to talk about Brazil. We know the traditional allies that Russia has here: Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. I was in Nicaragua when Russia sent a lot of tanks to Nicaragua, and as the regime has become more authoritarian, we've seen more weapons transfers, which is an interesting situation there. But as far as aid and investment, it is limited, especially given Russia's full-time commitment now to the war, and it's stretched thin in its political and economic sphere. But I do think that the situation in Brazil is interesting, and I just want to stress to an American audience that I feel like that you can see it from very many different points of view. And in the US press, we hear about it a lot, mostly, I would say, from the US point of view, and that Lula, the president here now, is not siding with the West and has turned his back on his Western allies. And so just kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit more. And from the point of view, this is not my point of view, this is the Brazilian point of view, the government's point of view, not all Brazilians. But, you know, just to update on politics here in Brazil, you know, this is a very divided country. Last year was an extremely close and polarizing elections. The far right president, then Jair Bolsonaro, was a nationalist. Well, he still is a nationalist, and he had a very inward foreign policy. And Brazil very much retreated on the world stage. And Lula's campaign was he was going to bring back Brazil and put it back on the world stage. Well, even during the times of Bolsonaro, when he was very looking inward, he did reach out to Russia, because as Vladimir very much laid out perfectly, was that there is a huge interest, economic ties between Russia and Brazil, especially when it comes to fertilizer. I never knew how much the world was dependent on Russian fertilizer until the war. But it is the agricultural export industry here in Brazil is very important to the economy, and Russian fertilizer is critical to that crucial economy. So that is an economic backdrop that we can't forget. And even Bolsonaro, who did not want to engage with Russia, you know, went to talk personally with Putin, left the country, which was rare, and went and spoke personally with Putin within days before the start of the war to secure those fertilizer shipments. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then you got to understand Lula. And Lula is he's an interesting leftist here in Latin America. You know, he is an old school leftist. This is his third time in power. He was in power in the 2000s. He came up as a union activist through the trade unions of Brazil during the Cold War, when Brazil had a military dictatorship. Lula was actually spent time in jail. You know, he is 67 years old, and he is very wary of a world defined as pro or against Russia. That is his personal point of view. Wait, I already talked about the fertilizer. And then Brazil, during Lula's first terms in office, became part of the BRICS. And that's also, you know, very important too. And he is in the BRICS with Russia and China and India and South Africa. And, you know, this is the global South's attempt to, you know, break the US dominance and the dollar's dominance in the world. And so this is what a lot of developing countries' leaders fear. You know, they do not like the global financial system with the dominance of the dollar. The IMF, the World Bank administrate, they see it as them miring the poor in debts that hamstring their futures and their future ambitions. And so I think that gets lost a lot of times on that perspective on a US audience. So Lula also is 67 years old. I keep bringing back to that. He is working on his legacy. You know, he really wants to build his legacy, and he wants to be seen as this world leader, not just where he is most comfortable in the environmental sphere, but he also wants to be seen as a global mediator. Back in his first terms, he tried to do that as he tried to mediate a Iranian nuclear position, which actually fell apart. But that is something that he's always tried to do. And it also is keeping with Brazil's non-interventionist foreign policy, neutrality foreign policy. He's made a lot of missteps lately, and we could talk about this too. But I always feel like I have to explain that to a US audience, that is who Lula is, and that's where he's coming from. You know, and then I talked to some analysts too when Lula was heading. He's made a lot of foreign policy trips. Like he's been in office for 4 months, and he's already been to first off, he went straight to the US, he wasn't given like the best time slot either. He was given a Friday afternoon meeting in the Oval Office, like rushed in and rushed out, and that was it, and gave a little, gaggle speech in the dark, and then he came back home. So it wasn't like the great meeting. Then he went to China, where like he brought half of the business community here with him and nearly the entire cabinet and governors, and was just given this huge welcome. So he's getting different receptions at different places. Right after that, he hosted the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And then he went to Portugal and to Spain. So he's been around the world pretty a lot in the last 4 months, the first 4 months of his administration. One thing he wants is for Brazil to be seen as a world power and to get a permanent position on the UN General Council. Brazil's there now, but it's on a rotating basis, and he wants that changed. He wants Brazil to be seen more as a global power and to be permanent on the US Council. So, he stumbled a bit on securing his neutrality legacy. In China, he accused the US of stimulating the war. The White House reprimanded him or rebuked him, saying that he was just parroting Russian and Chinese propaganda. He also, at the same time, let in 2 Iranian warships into the port of Rio. That didn't go over too big in the West either. And they were docked here for a little bit. And then, of course, hosting Lavrov before that, he hosted the German chancellor and said he would not provide munitions to Ukraine. Wasn't happy. The West wasn't happy with that either. But the German chancellor was rebuked in Chile too, and in Argentina. Let's see, what else I want to say. Oh, and Lavrov's tour when he was here too, that did not make the US very happy either, because he gave Lavrov a open mic in a Western democracy to give the perspective of Russia on the war. So that was not looked very well. And we did hear some spokespeople in the US condemning that. And then critics point out that Brazilian officials have met in person with both Putin and with Sergei Lavrov, but they've only dealt with Ukraine over the phone. But there is talk of maybe the foreign advisor to Lula going personally to Ukraine within the next couple of weeks. We'll have to see if that happens. And then the UN ambassador to the UN is here, and she has made it clear that the US is not happy with Lula's positions. And then my favorite part about Russian interactions in Brazil at this time that we have to think about is that the discovery that 3 Russian spies were able to work in the West, actually go to Johns Hopkins, not far from y'all, there in Colombia, with their fake Brazilian IDs that they were able to secure here and their identities. And 2 of the spies are not in Russia at this time, but one is here in jail and is being held on fraudulent charges. Russia says that he is not a spy, that he is an international narcotics dealer, and they want him to be extradited. And the US wants him to be extradited, saying that he is a spy. And so that is all interesting for journalists to cover, with lots of backstories and how they lived here. And that the one spy that is in jail here in Brazil actually did a master's on a Brazilian student visa at Johns Hopkins. SAIS, right? And then got an internship at the International Criminal Court, where it's very interesting. So it's like a scene right out of the Americans series. Anyway, so I will stop there if you have any other questions, but I do think that it's an interesting time to look at Russia in Latin America, but looking at it through the Latin American perspective, and especially Lula, his return to power, building his legacy, and his commitment to breaking the US dominance in international circles and standing up for the global South.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie. Very interesting.
Did I keep the time?
Oh yeah, you're definitely a little bit under time. So we have time now for for a thorough question and answer period. So I invite viewers to write their questions in the question and answer box. And while it's a webinar, so I can't unfortunately unmute any of our viewers, but while we're waiting for questions, I will, I suppose, just ask all members of the panel the degree to which this is kind of just an empirical question. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the rhetoric of decolonization. And with regard to Brazil, I'm just wondering if you hear the leaders or members of the press speaking about, you know, kind of parroting what would be Russian rhetoric with regard to, as laid out, you know, so clearly by Elena's comments. If this is something kind of like you hear, do you really think that this RT is working? Or do you think it's more just, I mean, maybe Elena would like to talk about this, but also just people who are, you know, the other panelists who are living there? Or do you think that there's a kind of, you know, continuity of that kind of resonates in a background way? Or is there actual picking up of the terms and the tropes and the messages that are being pushed by Russia via RT among the population or among Latin American or Brazilian members of the media? And I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, how effective those messages, those specific messages are since the war, especially in light of Elena's point that the population, the ordinary people in Brazil are not as not as enamored of these kinds of ideas of the kind of longstanding leftist ideas of decolonization, and are better informed about what's going on in Ukraine and better informed about Bucha, as you said.
Well, I think speaking about decolonization and contemporary Russian politics, we must understand a very important paradox that, of course, today we can see the final etap of destroying of Soviet Empire. And so many forces are accusing Russia and Soviet Union to be empire, to be colonized. And so I think it was very interesting idea to use the same rhetoric in order to present new image of Russia. But the question of I think the new concept of Russian foreign policy is written very good, very well, and so it is very logical, and the legacy of Soviet Union is very convenient to all this discourse. But of course, if the people know about real Soviet history, about real Russian history, well, these people understand that this is not more than simulacra. This is not more than falsification of the idea of decolonization. But if we speak about the people from many countries who have a very poor knowledge about Russian and Soviet history, I think this decolonization rhetoric can be a very effective tool of Russian propaganda, because this is Russia tries to demonstrate that Soviet Union was not empire. And so, if we see, if we are agree with this point, okay, in this situation we can speak about Soviet Union as a decolonial force. But if we will try understand better the Russian history, of course, this is poor falsification. But I think it can be very good tool for Russian propaganda. And this is why I focused on this moment.
RT isn't here in Brazil.
Yeah. Okay, well, that solves that problem. But I guess I wonder, I guess more broadly, maybe not specific RT messages, but this is a little bit of a different focus, but do you hear people criticizing the sanctions or the effects of the sanctions as a kind of, tool of the West and as part of playing into that whole imperialist or anti-Western feelings?
Sorry, we speak about Russia.
No, I meant in Latin American countries. Do you hear criticism? Of course, in Russia, criticism of the sanctions, but I mean criticism of the effect that the sanctions are having on one's country, Brazil or Vladimir.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to add what Elena was saying, I think we have to take into consideration several things. First of all, Russian strategic communication and RT and Sputnik as part of these efforts to spread this kind of message from Russia is tailor-made. And in Latin America, the messaging is quite different from the messages diffused by RT and Sputnik in other parts of the world. Second, I think the second dimension of this strategic communication of Russia is a part of a whole ecosystem that Russia has in Latin America in place. Look, Russia has its presence everywhere in Latin America. Russian nationals can travel freely everywhere in Latin America. This is a very interesting point, Elena, and this is excellent point, actually. You raised about this new flow of Russians coming into Latin America because it is becoming part of that ecosystem. Russian embassies complement what RT is doing, what RT is saying, what Sputnik is saying, plus this co-patriot organization that been nurtured by the Soviet embassy since for, I would say 10 years already. I mean, we Russian nationals living in Latin America, we felt suddenly 10 years ago, more or less, that our embassies turned their faces towards us. It was quite unusual, and the feeling was quite nice back then. You're part of the Russian world, we can help you. We'd like to be part of all these efforts, but now you understand, of course, it's quite instrumental, and they can now use a lot of things through channeling this, a lot of things through these compatriot organizations. But this point of decolonization it's quite interesting because this is new. I would say this is new, and from being based in Latin America, I would say this message was very silent. It was not very visible before the war in Ukraine. But now I think Russia understood that this message will very well resonate in Latin America. And Elena has all the reasons saying that there is, of course, the lack of knowledge of what today's Russia is. And this is the attempt to equate today's Russia with the Soviet Union. And it serves perfectly. The Soviet Union ended with the Russian Empire. According to the Soviet message, the Soviet Union is not Russian Empire, was not Russian Empire. So we have nothing to do with this colonized power that the Russian Empire was. So it's very much resonates with the ideas that the left here has, and the sympathy of the left forces towards Russia, of course, not willing and not wishing facing the facts. They're not interested in learning the facts. They want to have this kind of ideal alternative point of power, imaginary power, and Russia is as Elena was saying, is doing a great job and through its 2023 foreign policy doctrine, just matching perfectly the expectation and the aspiration in many cases of Latin American leaders. So talking about sanction, also new stuff. The first sanction, of course, were introduced when imposed on Russia following Crimea in 2014, but it was silent. Nobody would say we suffer to the same extent as Cuba does, as Venezuela. And it's now a common point. Look, guys, the US is punishing us. The West is punishing us the same way they punish Cuba, the same way they punish Venezuela. And then we're doing right stuff then. And so it's been quite successful. People, not exactly they condemn, they get, because the message also by RT, just yesterday, one of my students in my class, who is a big fan of RT, was saying, look, sanctions do not work. Sanctions, Russia is doing great, substituting imports, this typical message of Russia. But yes, there has been novelties because of that. And sanctions, of course, it's another excuse for Russia to say, we're doing the right stuff, and we expect Latin America to show solidarity with us because we suffer because we are against the U.S. dominance on the world stage.
Yes, I completely agree. I would like to emphasize that this idea of decolonization is very new, because it was formulating only now in new doctrine months ago. This is why I think this idea was not promoted enough in Latin America, but this idea has some possibilities.
I would just add, I think it's generational too, because the leaders are older and lefties and older leftists, and the way people get their news today here, and then throughout Latin America, you don't hear a lot of that. Although sanctions, when food prices go up, everybody's looking for somebody to blame. So I think you hear a lot of that too. But I think people are getting their news in a lot different ways.
You mean the younger generation's getting its news in a different, yeah.
Yeah, and
right.
I just don't think they're getting that, especially, a lot of it is TikTok, and a lot of it is, not even Twitter or anything, TikTok and Instagram. And here, especially the United States still looms large, and U.S. news forces are way outnumber any sort of Russian news forces, even, and especially like the big leftist news force here is, Venezuela, Telesur. Telesur is an English channel too, but they don't have a Portuguese channel either.
Yeah, jump in, Vladimir, and then Elena. Yeah, just go ahead.
Yes, I agree, but partially with Carrie. Why? I do agree with you that a young generation is getting news completely different way than old generation, but still, Petro, for example, in Colombia, is an idol for young generation. So they believe 100% what he is saying. And he represents that older generation, he view the world like we are living in 19th century, and what he's saying is never questioned by those young generation, despite of the fact that they get the news from the influencer. And so there is an interesting symbiosis, of that old thinking being idols like Lula, for example, of course, like some other people, but they kind of managed to impose at least this kind of analytical framework for the young generation, despite of the fact that young people are getting news from other sources.
No, I think we agree. That's what I'm saying. It's the older generation leftist politicians that say that line. It's the younger and the young, they love Lula here too. That's interesting about Petro that they love him.
I would like to say some words about a new wave of Russian immigration to Latin America also, because I think this position of neutrality and this Lula words about we need to stop war is these words are resonating very well with the position of many liberal Russians who is against Kremlin, but who has a very big disillusion with the West. This is why, for example, in Russian liberal mass media, we're circulating one article, essay, sanctions as colonial practice. And so what I would like to say is that these people who decided to go to Latin America, to migrate to Latin America, these people explain their position that we would like to go to Latin America because in Latin America nobody will blaming us because we are Russians, and this is why. The people who would like to immigrate to Latin America, this is anti-Kremlin people. This is oppositional force, but at the same time, this is the people who is open to this decolonial idea. Open to Latin America. And this is why the courses of Spanish language is full now in St. Petersburg and Moscow. This is very popular courses.
That is really fascinating. And, you know, just this morning, NPR reported that U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, was in Brazil and talking to, I think it was students or an audience of younger people. And she said that there were no questions about the war, or the report said there was no, the war wasn't mentioned. Then she mentioned it. And then she said the kind of Western point, which is that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of democracy, on behalf of the West, on behalf of all these other countries. So people there should care about the war. And I thought to myself, I wonder how well that point was received, since it so clearly seems like an American and a kind of, you know, one of the main points that's coming out. And yeah, so your comments about the kind of Russians coming there really are interesting, and about the almost maybe there's just a battle, especially in Brazil, but perhaps other places, for the kind of for the whether Russians' rhetoric is really resonating, because we hear lately that Russia has won popular opinion in the global South, but it doesn't seem like it's so clear cut for Latin America. Vladimir?
I think most of Latin American societies in that respect are quite polarized. I mean, you have people who do support 100% the US and Western view of why is happening, what is happening in Ukraine. And you have the other people who do not accept anything coming from the US and the Western media, and may not accept 100% of what Russia is saying, but definitely do not accept and do not support the US point of view. However, we do find, at least from my perspective, some common point between these two polarized segments of the society. And this is important. That's what I was attempted at least to say in the last part of my presentation today, is people are watching what the US is trying to do and what the West is trying to do in Ukraine, and they come to conclusion they are failing. They are not capable to achieve any plausible results. People are dying in Ukraine. And Russia is continuing doing what is doing, and there are a lot of doubts in the idea that the world order as we know it, Western liberal world order, will survive. And that is why people trying to understand what will come next, and they can find answers because the way they see the attempts, like you mentioned, by the US ambassador in Brazil to explain the US point of view and to emphasize the importance of democracy, which I think the right thing to do. But then again, it's not sufficiently powerful to say, look, just we will overcome what is happening in Ukraine and we go back to things as normal, back to normal. Many people doubt that it will happen. And I think that it's also neat, if I would be saying that what can be done, I mean, we have to think what kind of message should be sent here, because also, I mean, many political leaders here are not particularly in love with liberal democracy. I mean, this is not particularly a forceful enough argument to say, we need to defend Ukraine because Ukraine is a democracy. And they say, well, we're not particularly fans of liberal democracy. Why should we support Ukraine in that sense? And I think that this is more profound kind of troubles we are facing here. Thank you.
That's such a great point. It's so true that democracy is in peril in Latin America. That's an excellent point. So to give that argument, the US reaction that we have to do everything to save democracy in the world, it does not resonate in a lot of places.
Really interesting. Yeah. Thank you. And Elena, thank you so much for the point about the Russians emigrating. I hadn't sort of, well, first of all, we just didn't know, about this large number. I've heard of some Russians coming to Mexico and then trying to get to the US from Mexico, actually. But I mean, Russians are going everywhere, so it's not, surprising. But it's really interesting.
There's a lot of Russians in Mexico City that live there. They don't leave. They're not going to the to the border there and live and work in Mexico City, but there's a lot of Russians in Argentina. I was just in Buenos Aires last week, and a lot of women are coming to Argentina to have babies and to get an Argentinian passport. So it's quite interesting. I was in a park, and there was a postnatal yoga class full of Russian mothers. there you hear Russian everywhere.
Even in Colombia, imagine, even in Colombia, the websites, Facebook sites, Russians in Colombia, Russians in Bogota, full of messages from Russians who are saying, we are planning to come to Colombia. Please explain on how things are, where we can read stuff, how to get document, and full of them. It's been an explosion, actually.
And my daughter's best friend in high school is Russian, and her mother would only hire Russians. The photographer at our graduation party had to be Russian. There's a lot of Russians in Mexico City.
Yes, but I think this is a question that this way of immigration will be increasing, because the people who learn Spanish now, this is the people who would like to immigrate to Latin America, not to Spain. And but these people would like to manage more reasonable strategy to immigrate. This is not people who would like to immigrate immediately for the reasons of mobilization. Mobilization, this is, of course, this is another case. But this is people who are visiting these courses. These people are trying to construct new strategy to survive. And in this case, Latin America is a good choice because Europe is closed for Russian people. Well, Georgia, Armenia, well, it is very difficult to survive because many Russians now are in Armenia and Georgia. So Latin America, why not? And it is possibility to fly also. So this is why I said that this is more long-term forecast. This is not situation which will change situation now. It's in our future. A new Russian diasporas, I think, in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's something that I certainly hadn't been on our radar when we think about the consequences of the war or Russian Latin American relations. And then also this really fascinating point that you were making, Vladimir, about the kind of perceptions about the future and the changed world order and declining. Well, many of you made the point that people do not want to be pulled between two poles, but at the same time, this kind of idea that maybe there will be a declining influence of democracy and Western influence, or the liberal international order as a result of the war, which is certainly not how the U.S. and the West sees it or positions the post-war order. That's really an interesting perspective that I don't think we heard that before. Well, it's possible that we just don't have we have many conversations among people who are on the same page. And this is exactly why we have these kinds of panels, so that we can get a broader perspective and understand the various perspectives and approaches of people living in different parts of the world. So thank you for that, as well as all the other really interesting comments. And it looks like Nicaragua, sorry, not Nicaragua, Brazil. I don't know why I said Nicaragua. It's the exact opposite of the point I was going to make. The Brazil, is a exciting and important place to watch, especially with regard to what it does with China and how it positions itself, or how it positions itself in relation to the BRICS, and whether it's sort of going to try to continue to play both sides, or position itself as being open to both U.S. and Chinese influence, or whether it feels like it, as you said, I think Elena, you said that it's hard to be a great power and not have a clear position, but certainly, many countries try to do that for a long period of time. And in this regard, we can see a lot of similarities with India. It's quite interesting. So I guess if there are any final thoughts or comments, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion and something new for a lot of members of our audience will be hearing something new today. Do any of the panelists want to make any final? Vladimir? Yeah.
Just a final remark. I mean, we are living in very interesting times, and I often talk about this with the students. Mm-hmm. We always see something new these days. And sometimes it's very difficult to understand precisely what is happening. But those are turbulent times, and I hope that someday we'll remember those days that we live now with a smile, like I do have now. But I'm really worried in a way that, of course, what is happening now in Latin America and Russia is just an excuse. I think it's an important excuse to talk about the changes in Latin America. But we perhaps in 10 years from now, we will see completely different region. And also we're talking about regional leadership like Brazil, but I have my doubts. I do agree with Carrie about Lula wanted to have its legacy. And I had the chance on several occasions to be in a relatively smaller audience with Lula several years ago in Medellin, for example. And of course, he seems to be not a typical left, in a way that he constructs his narrative and in how he talks about the vision for Brazil. But I agree with the point that Brazil is definitely pointing to be this decisive power in the new arrangement, no global arrangement. Yes, and Brazil has the capacity to do this. Where I have my doubts, it's that Brazil will manage to be accepted in a way as a regional leader from Latin America. And there are many others who perhaps are not, they may support Brazil in this adventure, but not necessarily eager to see Brazil just too strong and to accept it as, the voice of one Latin America. There are a lot of heterogeneous interests here among the countries. So Latin America is quite diverse. But then again, it's 500 million people, so it's really a force. I have no doubt that Russia, China, Turkey, and all these extra hemispheric players, actors, will continue to have their interest in Latin America. We'll look for opportunity to change the status quo, and again, we have to continue watching what is happening here. And thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you. I think this has been a really fabulous conversation. I know I learned a lot. Elena, you want to make some final comments?
Well, I would like to say thank you very much for this opportunity. So.
Good. No, thank you again for coming, making the time, and sharing your expertise with our audience. And just to remind one more time that we will be posting this. You can access it through Harriman websites. This is part of the program on U.S.-Russian relations and then there's a link to YouTube and to Facebook. So you can see the recording of this session. And I will make a quick plug for our final event of the academic year, which I'm moderating tomorrow, which is a book talk on post-violence, post-Beslan tragedy in Russia by Deborah Javelin. And we are having a guest in person of Russian independent journalist Elena Milashina. So that will be a very different kind of event, but not recorded and in person. But anyone who's still in our session is welcome to attend. So thank each of you again so much, and good luck with your work, and all the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vladimir. Okay.